Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Sarah Siegel, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Robert Paarlberg, discussing his latest book, Resetting the Table, straight talk about the food we grow and eat. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we're hosting events here on Zoom. And as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk today, go to the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you would like to buy a copy of Resetting the Table, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase it. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you for your support of community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link to donate in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever, support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last few months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Now, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Robert Paarlberg is an associate in the Sustainability Science program at the Harvard Kennedy School and an associate at Harvard's Weatherhead Center. He has been a member of the Board of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the National Research Council, a member of the Board of Directors at Winrock International, and a consultant to the International Food Policy Research Institute, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In addition to Resetting the Table, he is the author of Starved for Science, Food Politics, and the United States of Excess. Today, he is discussing Resetting the Table, straight talk about the food we grow and eat. Consumers want to know more about their food, including the farm from which it came, the chemicals used in its production, its nutritional value, how the animals were treated, and the cost to the environment. They are being told that buying organic foods, unprocessed and sourced from small local farms, is the most healthful and sustainable option. Now, Robert reviews the evidence and finds abundant reason to disagree. He finds solutions that can make sense for farmers and consumers alike and provides a roadmap through the rapidly changing worlds of food and farming, laying out a practical path to bring the two together. Without further ado, I will turn things over to our speaker. Robert, the virtual podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And I'd like to thank the Harvard Bookstore for arranging this event and giving me a chance to talk about my new book. The Harvard Bookstore has been my favorite independent browsing bookstore for many years. So it's an honor now to be here, at least virtually. And at this point, of course, I would normally thank my listeners for coming out on a cold February evening to attend a book talk, but Zoom has made going out anywhere much less necessary than in the past. I think it was Woody Allen who once said that 95% of life is just showing up. Well, that 95% of life has suddenly become much easier. But thank you for listening in. Before I talk about my book, I should say a little bit more about how I developed my interests in food and agriculture. It came through my family. My father was raised on a small farm in Indiana. He went on to become an agricultural economist and a senior government official. The farm was taken over by his brother, my uncle. And I used to work on the farm for some weeks in the summers when I was a teenager. And I developed a deep interest in agriculture. And later, when I went on to get a PhD in political science, I thought food and agriculture could be a good niche. It's a field that's normally dominated by economists. A political scientist could have something to say and get a seat around the table. And that's what I've done for my career, working internationally with some of the organizations that Sarah mentioned. I've done work in 15 or 16 countries in Africa, half a dozen countries in Latin America and half a dozen countries in Asia. In fact, before COVID, I was scheduled to spend last September at the China Agricultural University in Beijing. I'm not going to share any PowerPoint slides this evening. I'm a political scientist, and political scientists know that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So you'll be safe from any screen sharing. I do like to write books. This book, Resetting the Table, is actually the 10th book that I've written, but it's the very first one that is written for a broad general audience of non-specialists instead of for students or for other academics. I went out and got a trade publisher, and I'm hoping that through events like this, I can spread the word that this is a book for everybody. I wrote the book to explain exactly what's broken about our food system, especially here in the United States. What's the evidence that our food system is broken? Well, it's staring at us. Over the last 4 decades, the percent of American adults who have become clinically obese has tripled. Just prior to COVID, the latest data showed that 42% of American adults were obese. This, of course, brings chronic disease problems, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke. This is a serious public health crisis. It was arguably our most serious public health crisis before COVID. Now, for the moment, because of COVID, our attention is turning elsewhere. We're facing a serious crisis of food insecurity during COVID because of income loss due to job loss and because schools have closed, and so school lunches are not available and restaurants have closed. So food service is less available. But once we get through the pandemic, I suspect we will discover that not only are we returning to our previous dietary health crisis of excess food consumption, it might have even worsened. We'll all have gained a few pounds during COVID, and we'll have farther to go to return to dietary health. So I wrote my new book because I had seen among my students and among my friends, when I talk about our dietary health crisis linked to obesity and chronic disease, they believed that there were some obvious solutions that they'd heard about. And I didn't think they were so obvious at all. I didn't think they were going to solve the problem. And in fact, in some cases, I was pretty sure that they would worsen the problem. So let me run through 4 of those proposed solutions before I offer my own diagnosis and a few solutions of my own. The 4 proposed solutions I'm going to talk about are shifting toward the consumption of more organically grown foods. Number 2 would be shifting toward the consumption of more locally grown foods. Number 3 would be eliminating farm subsidies. And number 4 would be eliminating food deserts. So let me start with organically grown foods. A switch to organically grown foods would actually worsen our dietary health crisis. Not because organically grown foods are less nutritious than conventionally grown foods. Both, in my view, are equally nutritious. The science tells us organically grown foods aren't meaningfully more nutritious than conventional foods, although organic advocates say that they are. They point to such things as organic milk, which has 50% more beta carotene than conventional milk. And that's true, it does. But they don't tell you that conventional milk has so little beta carotene that 50% of almost nothing is still almost nothing. Nutritionists have simply not been able to confirm the claim that organically grown foods are more nutritious. The problem with organically grown foods is that they're more expensive. The USDA reports that on average, organically grown produce is 54% more expensive than conventionally grown produce. If you make something more expensive, people will consume less of it. If we made fruits and vegetables in the marketplace 54% more expensive, people on a budget would purchase fewer fruits and vegetables, and our dietary health crisis would worsen rather than improve. Now, why are organically grown foods more expensive? The reason is farmers don't want to convert to organic methods. Organic methods make it impossible to use synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. You simply can't use any at all. It's a 100-year-old rule that goes with the organic tradition. And synthetic nitrogen fertilizer was one of the most productive scientific breakthroughs of the 20th century. Without nitrogen synthesized from the atmosphere, you have to get nitrogen from things like composted animal manure, and that's more laborious. It's something farmers don't want to do, and even with the nitrogen that comes from fertilizer or from planting cover crops or green manure, organic yields are still going to be lower than conventional yields that use synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So very few farmers have converted to organic methods. Only 1% of agricultural cropland in the United States is certified for organic production. That constrains the supply, and that's what drives up the price. So I don't think converting to organic foods is either desirable or likely. The organic segment of the market has grown, but the only way it's grown is actually by becoming more like industrial agriculture. We have organic farms in California, Earthbound Farm, that monopolizes the world of packaged baby greens. They operate 50,000 acres. This is not a small, diverse organic farm. This is an industrial scale specialized organic farm. We have organic dairy farms in Texas that have 18,000 cows. We have organic egg farms in Michigan that have 180,000 birds packed into every house. So the organic label seldom gets you access to what you think you're buying, which is a product from a small, local, diverse, traditional organic farm. These are industrial products, and that's another reason why I don't think we should imagine moving toward them is a solution to our dietary health problem. Now, we see something similar for locally grown foods. There's hope that if we abandoned industrial farming and went back to small local farms, diverse farms that had animals and crops together, some would be organic, some would not. The hope is that if we relocalized our food system, that would be good for dietary health. The food would be grown closer to the consumer, it would be fresher, it would be more nutritious. But in fact, once again, if we tried to relocalize our system, our dietary health would probably go down. This is because, once again, fresh fruits and vegetables can't be grown year-round in large parts of the United States. People who live in places like New England wouldn't be able to get as many fresh fruits and vegetables in the winter months. And we couldn't get tropical products at any time if we went for a strictly local food system. The availability of fresh fruits and vegetables in our marketplace today depends heavily on imports. The United States today imports half of its fresh fruit consumption and 1/3 of its fresh vegetables. And I think it's good that we do. If we didn't import those products, the offerings in the marketplace would be more meager. Instead of going toward local farms, we're actually continuing to go toward globalization. The imported share of American food in 1990 was 11%. Now it's up close to 20%. So So not only would relocalizing, I think, worsen our dietary health, it's something that's not going to happen anyway, in my view. What about ending farm subsidies? The argument here is that, well, the government subsidizes the production of energy-dense commodities like corn, and that so then we produce a lot of corn. Michael Pollan said we're living under a plague of cheap corn, and he traces this to farm subsidies. The cheap corn goes to livestock production, so we eat too much meat, and it goes into snack foods, junk foods. Corn syrup goes into sugary beverages. That's the argument, that we're putting bad food into the marketplace because we're subsidizing commodities like corn. Well, if you ask an agricultural economist, is it true that corn is artificially cheap because of farm policy and farm subsidies? They'll tell you no. They'll point out that actually corn is artificially expensive in the United States because of the policies we put in place to help farmers. Since the 1980s, and particularly since the 2000s, the United States government has mandated that a certain quantity of corn be used every year to produce auto fuel, to produce ethanol for auto fuel. Currently, about 1/3 of all corn produced in the United States is taken out of the food supply completely and used for auto fuel. That makes corn for food use and for animal feed use artificially expensive, not artificially cheap. We also make wheat artificially expensive through something that's called the Conservation Reserve Program, which rents farmland in western Kansas from farmers for 10 years at a time. They don't plant anything in it at all. We also make sugar artificially expensive by blocking imports of inexpensive sugar from the world market at the border. Sugar inside the United States market is 64% more expensive than sugar on the world market. So instead of making food artificially cheap, farm subsidies make food artificially expensive. And this makes perfect sense. The purpose of farm subsidies is to increase the income of farmers, not to make food cheap for consumers. A fourth solution that I don't find promising would be to eliminate food deserts. Food deserts are either inner city areas or places in remote rural communities that don't have supermarkets. The argument is, if people can't get access to a supermarket that has fresh fruits and vegetables, they're forced to rely on unhealthy foods, energy dense, obesity inducing unhealthy foods. They'll go to fast food restaurants, they'll go to convenience stores, they'll go to corner bodegas, they'll buy lunch at a gas station. People in food deserts simply don't have access to the healthy foods they need to have a healthy diet. This sounded plausible until people took a closer look, and they first looked what happened to eating patterns in neighborhoods after new supermarkets appeared. And they found that people could buy food more conveniently, but they bought the same foods. Dietary patterns didn't change. And then someone did a very careful experiment. They defined food deserts in terms of physical proximity to supermarkets. And they compared outcomes in food deserts to communities that weren't food deserts, and they found almost no difference at all. Then they defined what they called a food swamp. A food swamp is a neighborhood that has a high ratio of places to buy unhealthy foods compared to supermarkets where at least you can get healthy foods. They found that it was the presence of a food swamp, not the presence of a food desert, that was driving our crisis in dietary health. They found that if you controlled for food swamps, the influence of food deserts became completely insignificant. So we have to worry about food swamps, not food deserts. And we have to start by asking, who gave us these food swamps? And it's pretty clear they didn't come from farms. They came from food manufacturing companies, from retailers, and from the restaurant industry, from the food service industry. These private companies take the commodities grown on our farms and they formulate them, they design them to be irresistible. They add sugar, they add salt, they add fat, they make them ultra processed so you don't even have to chew. Uh, People are attracted to these foods. A segment of the population is attracted to these foods, becomes virtually addicted to them. Several things go on when you eat these kinds of food. First, the ultra processing means that you eat much more quickly, and your stomach doesn't have time to tell your brain that it's full, so you overeat. Experiments have been done with a diet of foods, identical foods, the same caloric content, the same taste. Some are ultra processed and some are minimally processed. The consumers that are given the ultra processed diet consume 500 more calories a day. And it's mostly because of the speed that they eat. When asked afterwards if it tasted better than minimally processed, they say no, it tastes the same, but they just ate faster because of the ultra processing. Food companies also, of course, add sugars to foods, not just sugar sweetened beverages, not just ice cream, but a lot of the packaged foods in the supermarket, in the center of the supermarket, have added sugars. And these added sugars spike our insulin and tell the body to store calories in our fat cells. That adds weight. Also, if you consume sugars this way as added sugars, it doesn't satiate. You're left hungry sooner than if you got your sugars through things like oranges. The final thing that food companies do is they have food scientists that study with great care how to combine sugar, salt, fat, color, texture, in ways that will make a food crave-worthy. If we put these foods on the back of our tongue, they hit what's called a bliss point. They trigger a dopamine high, and the reward circuit in our brain remembers that, and any future encounter with that food will cause us to crave having more. It's interesting. When we're hungry, we're not just hungry. We're usually craving a particular food, and quite often these are foods that we've been conditioned to crave by the food scientists that work for food manufacturing companies. Of course, the same thing for restaurants, and not just fast food restaurants. Full service restaurants have meals that are just as addictive, just as crave-worthy. Then, of course, having produced these things that they're trying to sell to us, they advertise them vigorously, and they put them within reach all the time. The Coca-Cola company said its strategy was to keep Coca-Cola always within just an arm's reach of desire, so that when our reward circuit saw a picture of a Coca-Cola, or if we saw an Oreo, or if we saw Lay's potato chip, the craving would be triggered, and we would overconsume. So how can we fight back against this? Now the problem is not that these companies, the restaurants, the manufacturing companies, the retailers, it's not that they're monopolistic. It's actually quite the opposite. They're fiercely competitive with each other. And they know that if any one company gets out ahead and removes these addictive food products from their list of offerings, they'll lose sales to a competitor. They'll lose market share. Companies Some companies try to pull back. Some restaurant chains try to pull back, and they lose customers. I looked at the restaurant chain Applebee's, which concentrates on comfort food. That means a lot of cheese. And they tried several years ago to remove some of the all-you-can-eat items, some of the chicken and riblets items from their menu, and their customers went away. They hired a new CEO, and he brought back the riblets and the all-you-can-eat items, and the customer base returned. It's very difficult for any one company to take the lead in making our food supply more healthy. Now, of course, it's not as simple as this. There are different kinds of customers out there. The marketing people will tell you that there are at least 3 different categories of eaters. There are health conscious eaters, many of them highly educated, who would never go to an Applebee's or buy Oreos cookies or drink Coca-Cola. These people don't even listen to the ads. They're not influenced one way or another. At the other extreme, there are the eat, drink, and be merry types who would overindulge in unhealthy foods, even if they weren't being advertised, even if they hadn't been carefully formulated to hit a bliss point. It's the people in the middle. They're called the people in the movable middle that can be influenced by these companies. It's those in the movable middle to whom most of the advertisements are targeted. A lot of these ads go to adolescents and to young people, many of them to minorities. A surprising share of television ads for junk foods are put up on programs that cater to minority populations. So not all customers are the same, but how can we protect the movable middle from being nudged in an unhealthy direction? Since no one company is going to want to go first, it becomes a job for the government to step in. Now, my friends at this point start accusing me of having joined the food police, but I don't think that's true. I'm not afraid of using the influence of government in response to genuine public health crises, and our obesity crisis and the chronic diseases that accompany it are a genuine public health crisis. I think we can learn from what many governments have done in Europe. Many countries in Europe have taken one of 3 steps. The first is to place excise taxes on sugar sweetened beverages, not sales taxes. You don't see the sales tax until you're already through the checkout line. If the excise tax shows up right there on the shelf, and it will make you think twice about buying an unhealthy product. A number of countries in Europe have imposed excise taxes on sugar sweetened beverages. In the UK, they actually have a good formula. They don't tax it by the ounce, they tax it by the sugar content. The value of doing things that way is not only to discourage consumer purchases, because the price does go up, it's also to encourage beverage companies to reformulate their products away from the high sugar content that was traditional. So excise taxes on junk foods and sugar sweetened beverages is one approach you can take. So far in the United States, federal government hasn't done that. State governments haven't done that. We have been able to do that at the municipal level in several cities since 2014. Berkeley went first with an excise tax on sugar sweetened beverages, then Philadelphia, then San Francisco, Seattle. Not too many cities have taken this course, but where it has been taken, sugar sweetened beverage consumption has gone down and bottled water consumption has gone up. So I'd like to see more of this done, not just at the municipal level, but also at the state level and the federal level. Of course, it's not easy. for the United States Congress to impose taxes on anything, let alone sugar-sweetened beverages. Even the Obama administration didn't propose a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages. Even with Michelle Obama promoting her Let's Move campaign against childhood obesity, President Obama said he was, in his campaign in 2008, he said he would never impose any new taxes on families with an income of less than $250,000. There's an anxiety that taxes will be regressive. Any kind of food tax will be regressive. And so Democrats are leery about taking that step. Republicans who are under the influence of the beverage industry are even more leery. So this is not an easy step to take. A second step that's being taken by European countries is to require, or at least to provide guidelines for front of package nutrition facts, nutrition information, and nutrition guidance. In the United States, we have a nutrition facts panel, which is on the side of the box. It's all fine print and small numbers. And it provides deeply curious customers with a pretty good profile of the food that's inside the box, but it doesn't work for people who are in a rush, who don't want to read the fine print, who could make use of something a little more at a glance. And in the UK, they've moved in that direction with a stoplight system. The front of packages now have stoplight symbols, red, yellow, and green, telling you which foods are optimal for nutrition, which are so-so, and which you might want to stay away from. It's still a voluntary system, but most food companies have embraced it, and it gives food consumers a way to be smart shoppers without having to be deeply studious shoppers. The United States doesn't yet have anything like this. We have a system that was designed by food companies. It's called Facts Up Front, and they do have symbols on the front of the package, but they aren't color coded, so you can't really learn anything at a glance. One of the best systems that we have that's not yet in widespread use, I wish it got wider use, is something called the Guiding Stars system. It was originally developed by the Hannafords, a food retailer. It's not a front of package system, it's a front of shelf system. They have an algorithm designed by good nutrition scientists that will award packaged food products either 3 stars if it's very good, 2 stars if it's not so good, 1 star, or 0 stars. And shoppers walking down the aisle, if you can go to a local Stop and Shop here in Massachusetts, and they have a guiding star system, and you can very quickly see which cereals have 0 stars and which cereals have 2 or possibly even 3 stars. It's a good system. Is it an honest system? I think it is, because when Hannaford's brought this system in, they applied it to the products on their own shelves, and they found that 2/3 of those products got 0 stars. So this was they didn't have to be that honest about the poor nutrition content of so many of the products in their own store. A third approach is to place restrictions on the advertising of junk foods, especially to children, especially on Saturday morning TV programs. In many countries in Europe, advertising anything to children is against the law. The United States has not done this yet. In the United States, we have a curious tradition. The Supreme Court back in 1976 decided that advertisements were commercial speech and deserved protection under the First Amendment. So it's very difficult in the United States for the government to tell private companies what they can and cannot advertise, as long as they're not deceiving customers by saying things that are untrue about the product. It's very difficult to discipline advertising, or in case the product isn't legal for people of certain ages to purchase. But otherwise, it's very hard to constrain the advertising behavior of companies in the United States. The Obama administration, when it first came into office, toyed with a voluntary code, but even that raised alarm among food companies, and they got their friends in Congress to prohibit even a voluntary code for advertising. So European countries have done these things. The United States so far has not. The Obama administration gave it a good try, but didn't get very far. And then the Trump administration came in and pulled back. The Trump administration even pulled back on the Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act that was passed successfully in 2010 under the Obama administration, which reformed school lunch menus. The Trump administration came in, and Trump's Department of Agriculture pulled back on some of those restrictions. They listened to the dairy industry, which wanted chocolate milk on the menu in school lunch programs. The Secretary of Agriculture, named Sonny Perdue, who has conspicuous girth, told a group of school children in Virginia that he wouldn't be as big as he was if he hadn't had chocolate milk growing up. And it's amazing how indifferent some advocates for U.S. agriculture are to the dietary health crisis. One thing that I recommend in my book, in the epilogue, in fact, is that commercial farmers in the United States, who may not be responsible for our obesity crisis, are getting themselves in trouble by associating themselves so closely with the food companies that are largely behind the problem. I advise commercial farmers to stop siding with the food companies politically and reach out to the public health community, make an alliance with the American Heart Association, for example, and advocate for dietary health. They wouldn't have to change the way they farm. If they created some political space between them and the food companies, they themselves would be less likely to be criticized. We'll see how this suggestion fares. Of course, the food companies come back and say, well, wait a minute. You're putting these foods in your mouth. It's not our fault. It's a matter of personal responsibility. What's my response to that? I say that, remember, obesity rates in the United States have tripled over the last 4 decades. Has personal irresponsibility really tripled over the last 4 decades? I don't think so. These food companies are creating an environment that too many people find impossible to resist. So before handing it over to questions and answers, I should just mention that I'm only talking tonight about one theme in my book. It's a book that covers quite a bit of ground. You'll find that I spend a chapter looking at industrial farming and what's called precision agriculture, which is reducing the environmental impact of modern farming methods. If you're interested in that and don't want to buy my book, you can look for an essay that will be published tomorrow in the Wall Street Journal about the upside of modern farming for environmental protection. I have a chapter that looks at the international push for what's called agroecology. And I show that although the United Nations system is all behind this, and many civil society organizations have been promoting it for decades, it hasn't scaled up so far. And I explore why. I discover that it's because these methods are labor intensive, and farmers don't have a lot of spare time on their hands. They don't want to spend all of their time hand gardening, hand weeding, hand pruning. They prefer methods that rely on science-based interventions, including the use of fertilizer and irrigation and mechanization. I have a chapter on, have to have a chapter on GMOs and genetic engineering. My chapter on GMOs shows that the big biotech companies have actually lost the battle. We have no GMO wheat, no GMO rice, no GMO potatoes, almost no GMO fruits or vegetables being grown for direct human consumption anywhere in the world. It's a surprising outcome. Just like in the biblical story, David slew Goliath, but I go on to say that there's another battle looming over gene-edited crops that are not developed using recombinant DNA. They're CRISPR-Cas9 crops instead of transgenic crops. I have also a chapter that looks at the welfare of farm animals and considers the dilemma of whether or not to raise these animals inside biosecure barns, and if so, how much space should they be given for ethical treatment. And I have a final chapter that looks at new technologies, everything from the use of robots and picking strawberries to the innovative new plant-based and cell-based imitation animal products, the Impossible Burgers, the Beyond Burgers, and the cell-based fish as well as meat that's going to be a part of your future. So let me stop there and turn it over to Sarah, who is going to help out with fielding some questions.
Yeah, we have some great questions coming in. I'm going to jump around a little bit because questions were being asked throughout your talk. So, two that are related. One says, organic foods, okay, they're more expensive and not more nutritious, but isn't it better that we eat foods with without the pesticides and poisonous fertilizers used on them? And related to that, someone asks, isn't organic farming better for the environment?
Okay, that's good. The pesticides question is an interesting and an important one. And this is actually what launched the modern environmental movement. Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, was a book about pesticides, DDT in particular. The organic rule was not a pushback against pesticides. It was a pushback against fertilizers. It got started well ahead of the modern pesticide era. I sometimes wish the organic rule focused on pesticides and didn't restrict fertilizers. If it didn't restrict fertilizers, many more farmers would be willing to certify as organic, and the organic size of the market would be much larger. Having said that, I don't worry too much about pesticide residues on foods. Thanks to Rachel Carson, we put much stricter regulations in place after 1962, created the Environmental Protection Agency. We banned DDT from agricultural use. We developed new varieties of pesticides that were far less toxic, far less persistent in the environment. And we developed ways to apply pesticides with much more precision and discrimination. In pesticide use, that's herbicides and insecticides today in farming, is 18% below where it was in 1980, 4 decades ago. And surprisingly, insecticide use, and this is what was the original concern, insecticide use is more than 80% below where it was in 1972. I know there are still concerns with insecticide residues on foods. My book provides some pretty detailed accounting of the calculations made by toxicologists at the Food and Drug Administration, and it comes up with a reassuring calculation of the risks that remain. Pesticides, insecticides in particular, are a serious risk. They remain a serious risk in developing countries where primarily a risk to the users, the applicators, the farmers who don't wear protective equipment, who don't know the formulations to use in applying the chemicals. It's a serious problem there. But in the United States, where applicators are registered and protected, and where residue tolerance levels are strict and inspected at the border as well as internally, I argue that this is far less of a problem than you would think. As for the other environmental consequences of organic, the big problem is organically grown foods uh, have lower crop yields per acre. And so you have to use more land. Or on average, organically grown foods, this is on commercial farms, yield 20 or 30% less per acre than conventional food. So if we wanted to produce the same amount of food, and a part of my book examines whether we should want to produce the same amount of food, but if we wanted to produce the same amount of food, if we went to organic methods exclusively, we would have to plow up more land and cut more trees and destroy more wildlife habitat. It's a difficult trade-off to quantify, but I think we save more of nature by increasing yields on land that's already plowed, avoiding the need to expand low yield farming into croplands that are now not plowed, or into wildlands that are not plowed.
So your comment about if we want to be producing the same amount of food segues nicely into this next question, which is, does your book address the issue of food waste, the sheer amount of food that restaurants, grocers, etc., throw away, and how that may affect the price and availability of food?
Yeah, I don't have a separate section on food waste. It's a difficult issue to summarize because people in different parts of the world waste food for completely different reasons. In developing countries, that's where my concern is focused, actually. It's better referred to as food loss. Farmers will grow a crop of maize or sorghum or millet, and they'll harvest the crop, but they won't have adequate storage on their farm. And it will be damaged by moisture or eaten by rodents before they can get it to the market. Or they'll slaughter a pig and get on their motorbike and head to town, but there's no refrigeration, there's no cold chain, and the meat can spoil before it can be sold. And these are countries that don't have a surplus of food. These are countries that work very hard to produce and to have access to what little food exists. It's that kind of food loss that bothers me the most. In rich countries, I don't know if waste is a good word either. In rich countries, food waste mostly occurs because we didn't need the food. We discard the food. It's better referred to as discarding food, unneeded food. And it's something that, I'm tormented about it. If someone is already consuming too much food and has type 2 diabetes or a heart condition, should they finish everything on their plate just to make sure they don't throw anything away? They should put less on their plate in the first place. That's their problem. Should supermarkets, what should supermarkets do? Should they leave food products out on the produce shelf that are no longer as pretty as they once were, but perfectly healthy, perfectly safe to eat? Or should they discard those? That's a tough question to answer. I'm all for avoiding the discarding of food and food waste. One thing that I might have said about locally grown foods is that more locally grown foods usually spoil compared to foods that are grown for the supermarket grid at a distance. Foods that are grown for supermarkets are picked and refrigerated immediately or flash frozen. Or if they're not frozen, they'll go straight to the canning facility. And they won't be loaded onto a truck and taken to the packing shed and then put on another truck and taken to the food hub, and then, or they won't be picked in the field in the morning and then sit out on the stand unrefrigerated at the farmer's market all afternoon. Foods lose their nutritious quality very quickly if the temperature reaches 70 or 80 degrees. And if they're not sold at the end of the day in a farmer's market, well, they might be fed to the pigs back at the farm, but that's not an optimal use of food. Our industrial food system produces a lot of unhealthy foods, as I've emphasized, but it's pretty good at avoiding needless waste of, at least of foods that people are willing to buy.
So one of our questions, you mentioned local, can actually go bad quicker. One of the questions is just simply, there's nothing wrong with eating locally when possible, right?
Nothing at all. Nothing at all. I mean, I enjoy local foods. There's a chapter in my book on local foods begins with a description of my favorite meal, which is our 4th of July clam bake up on the coast of Maine, where we get people together and build an oven out of stones on the beach at low tide, put a steel sheet over the top of the oven, throw in some cedar shakes and get it burning until it's super hot. Then you put down a layer of green seaweed that you gather yourself. Then you get the lobsters that were pulled out of the bay a day or two earlier. You go down to the co-op, which is a walk away, put the lobsters on top of the seaweed. Then you put the potatoes on top of the seaweed, and then you put more seaweed there. And then you put a sailcloth on top of the whole thing and wet it down with salt water. And it's going to be a wonderful feast before you know it.
Yeah, that sounds.
And it's all local. But the problem is you can't do that every day. It's too much work. And in addition, it's a meal that's not particularly healthy because there's too much melted butter and there's no green vegetables. On the 4th of July, you can't really get a lot of green vegetables up in Maine. So it's a trade-off between what I find pleasant and reassuring about locally grown foods. You're right, when convenient, when you have the time to prepare them properly, and when you're with others that will enjoy them in the same way that you do. But if you're a single parent with a full-time job and kids at home, do you really want to take the extra time to shop at the farmer's market? You're still going to have to go to the supermarket for paper products and for other things that the local farm doesn't grow. It's a convenience issue that gets in the way of a lot of localized consumption.
Totally unrelated here. Do the demographic categories that you mentioned, e.g. the movable middle, follow any sort of, sorry, the dog. Do the demographic categories, e.g. the movable middle, follow any sort of socioeconomic trend?
The marketing firm that came up with these categories, I don't remember them being broken out that way. The one socioeconomic trait that is identifiable is the higher educational attainment of the health conscious eaters. there's a clear correspondence between, there's not always a correspondence between affluence and, and healthy eating, but there is a clear correspondence between educational attainment and healthy eating. Difference between um, eat, drink, and be merry people and movable middle people is probably a little less socioeconomic, possibly, I don't know, I'm not going to guess. There's a piece of research that somebody ought to do.
Well, so that does lead into our last question, which we have time for, which is, does the relative price of food come up in your book at all? Kale is comparatively more expensive than instant rice. Would the interventions you propose in your book affect this price differential?
Yeah, the price, I guess I alluded to this just a moment ago. The price of healthy versus unhealthy food is not as important as most people assume. It's not the dollar cost of healthy food that makes it less consumed. It's the time cost. It's the inconvenience of shopping, um, peeling, chopping, cooking, and then cleaning up. That's what it's much easier. As I said, if you're a single working parent with kids at home, it's a lot easier to get a bucket of chicken than it is to cook from whole ingredients in your own kitchen and clean up afterwards. And on top of that, uh, healthy foods have been coming down in price at almost exactly the same rate as unhealthy foods. That surprises some people. But it's even true for snacks. Healthy snacks are cheaper than unhealthy snacks. People go for the unhealthy snacks because because the food scientists have designed an addictive taste that they want to get their mouth around. But the U.S. Department of Agriculture has come up with what it calls a thrifty meal plan. It's a meal plan for a family of four that allows you to meet all of the essential nutrition guidelines found in the dietary guidelines for Americans produced by the US government every 5 years. Under this thrifty meal plan, you can make a perfectly healthy meal for $2 a meal,
Oh, wow.
which is remarkably affordable. It's not the high price of healthy foods that keeps people from eating them. It's the inconvenience, it's the time cost, and it's a taste that hasn't been artificially juiced with sugar and salt.
So, speaking of time, we are about out of time here. So, I would like to thank Robert again for speaking with us tonight. And thank you all for tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, indie book selling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. If you would like to support Robert and the bookstore, please click on the links in the chat to purchase Resetting the Table. We sincerely appreciate your support. Thank you so much and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.